The CEO they just called security on was about to destroy their careers in the most satisfying way possible. When 3 employees told this unqualified black man he didn't belong in their prestigious firm, they had no clue he owned the entire company. Watch them go from arrogant bullies to terrified victims as their world comes crashing down in seconds. The identity reveal will give you chills, but the justice that follows will restore your faith in accountability. This viral moment changed corporate America forever, and you need to see every shocking second of how discrimination met its match. They had no idea the man they were insulting signs their paychecks every month. What started as a routine visit to check on company culture became the most shocking revelation this prestigious consulting firm had ever witnessed. But before we dive into this incredible story of justice and accountability, let me ask you something. Have you ever been judged by your appearance before anyone bothered to know who you really are? If so, you'll understand exactly why what happened next changed everything. Meet Derrick Lawson, a 48-year-old man walking through the pristine marble lobby of Sterling & Associates Consulting, one of the most respected firms in the corporate world. Dressed in a simple navy sweater and khakis, carrying a worn leather portfolio, Derrick looked like any other job seeker hoping for an opportunity. His calm demeanor and patient smile masked something far more significant than anyone in that building could imagine. You see, Derrick wasn't just any applicant. He was the founder and CEO of the entire company, conducting surprise visits across his branches after receiving anonymous complaints about racial bias in their hiring practices. The Sterling & Associates lobby buzzed with the usual corporate energy. Employees in sharp suits hurried past, their heels clicking against the polished floors. The reception desk, an imposing granite structure, sat beneath a wall displaying the company's core values: integrity, excellence, and respect. These weren't just words on a wall for Derrick. They were the foundation he'd built his empire on 15 years ago, starting from nothing but a dream and an unwavering belief that talent comes in all forms. As Derrick approached the reception desk, something immediately caught his attention. A young white man in a rumpled shirt was being warmly greeted by the receptionist, who smiled brightly and said, "Of course, Mr. Peterson. Let me get you some coffee while you wait. The hiring manager will see you shortly." The contrast became stark when Derrick stepped forward moments later. The receptionist's expression shifted noticeably, her smile fading as she barely glanced up from her computer screen. "Excuse me," Derrick said politely, his voice steady and professional. "I'm here to inquire about executive positions that might be available." The receptionist's eyes remained fixed on her screen, her fingers continuing to type as if he hadn't spoken. The silence stretched uncomfortably, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and distant conversations from the lobby seating area. Finally, without looking up, she spoke with a tone that would change everything. "We don't take walk-ins here. This is a prestigious firm. We only consider candidates with degrees from top-tier schools." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, but Derrick simply nodded, his expression remaining calm. What she didn't know was that this moment was being quietly documented not just by the man standing before her, but by the security cameras recording every second of what would become the most talked-about hiring incident in corporate history. The first seeds of discrimination had been planted, but this was only the beginning of a story that would expose everything wrong with corporate culture and how one man's patience would ultimately transform an entire organization. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button. It helps us share stories of justice and accountability with more people who need to hear them. Drop a comment below if you've ever faced discrimination, and don't forget to subscribe because we're just getting started with this incredible journey. Your support means everything to us, and together we can make sure stories like Derrick's inspire real change in our world. Right at that moment, the receptionist's dismissive words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. But what happened next would prove that first impressions can be devastatingly wrong. The woman behind the desk, completely unaware that she was speaking to the man who built the very company she worked for, was about to escalate a situation that would cost her everything she thought she knew about power and respect. Derrick stood there, absorbing the subtle but unmistakable message that his presence wasn't welcome. The receptionist, whose nameplate read Jennifer Mills, finally looked up with barely concealed annoyance. Her eyes swept over his modest attire with the kind of judgment that spoke volumes about the culture festering within his own company. This wasn't just about one employee's bias. This was a systemic poison that had apparently infected the very heart of what he'd worked so hard to build. "Look," Jennifer said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I don't know what kind of place you think this is, but we don't just hand out applications to anyone who walks in off the street. This is Sterling and Associates. We work with Fortune 500 companies, not." She paused, letting her eyes travel over his appearance again. "Whatever it is you're looking for." The cruelty in her tone was breathtaking, each word delivered like a calculated blow designed to make him feel small and unwelcome. But here's what made this moment so powerful. Derrick didn't react the way most people would. Instead of anger or frustration, he simply pulled out a small notepad and pen, calmly writing down the time, her name, and her exact words. This wasn't impulsive behavior. This was strategic documentation from a man who understood that real change requires evidence, not just emotion. The receptionist noticed his note-taking, and her expression shifted to one of irritation mixed with something else, a flicker of concern that maybe she'd misjudged the situation. "Are you writing down what I'm saying?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave if you can't respect our policies." The irony was staggering, a woman lecturing about respect while showing none herself, completely oblivious to the fact that she was speaking to the person who had personally signed off on every policy manual in the building. Derrick looked up from his notepad, his expression still remarkably calm. "I'm simply documenting my experience here today. As a potential candidate, I believe I have the right to understand your hiring process. Could you please explain why a degree from a top-tier school is required for me to even speak with someone about opportunities?" His question was reasonable, professional, and delivered without a trace of hostility, which somehow made Jennifer's defensive response even more damning. "Because that's how we maintain our standards," she snapped back, her patience clearly wearing thin. "We can't have just anyone thinking they can waltz in here and demand executive positions. Do you have any idea what kind of clients we serve? What kind of reputation we have to maintain?" Each word was another nail in the coffin of her career, though she had no way of knowing it yet. The lobby had grown quieter, with several employees and visitors beginning to notice the tension at the reception desk. Some pretended not to listen, while others openly stared, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Derrick glanced around, noting how his presence was being treated versus how other visitors were welcomed. The contrast was stark and undeniable, a pattern of discrimination so blatant it was almost hard to believe. "I see," Derrick said quietly, closing his notepad. "In that case, I'd like to speak with your hiring manager. I believe there may be some misunderstanding about qualifications and processes that needs to be addressed." His words were carefully chosen, giving Jennifer one last chance to course correct. Though deep down, he already knew this was just the beginning of a much larger problem that would require much more dramatic solutions. But the tragedy had not stopped yet. What Jennifer thought would be a simple dismissal of an unwelcome visitor was about to become a masterclass in how discrimination spreads like wildfire through an organization when toxic attitudes are left unchecked. The hiring manager she was about to call would prove that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a carefully cultivated culture of exclusion that had infected multiple levels of the company Derrick had built from the ground up. Jennifer picked up her phone with visible irritation, dialing an internal extension while maintaining eye contact with Derrick as if to demonstrate her authority. "Rachel, I have someone here who insists on speaking with you about job opportunities. He doesn't have the right qualifications, but he's being persistent." The way she emphasized persistent made it sound like a character flaw rather than determination. After a brief pause, she hung up and looked at Derrick with barely concealed smugness. "She'll be down in a moment, but I should warn you, Rachel Matthews doesn't appreciate having her time wasted." Within minutes, a sharply dressed woman in her early 40s emerged from the elevator, her expression already set in a mask of professional impatience. Rachel Matthews, the branch's HR manager, had clearly been briefed about the problem waiting for her. Her eyes swept over Derrick with the same dismissive assessment that Jennifer had performed, and her conclusion was equally swift and devastating. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a misunderstanding," Rachel said without even introducing herself. "We don't have any janitorial openings at the moment. You might want to try our facilities management department. They handle all the maintenance contracts for the building." The assumption was so blatant, so steeped in racial prejudice, that several nearby employees actually stopped their conversations to stare. The idea that a black man inquiring about executive positions must obviously be looking for custodial work was breathtaking in its audacity. Derrick's pen moved across his notepad again, calmly recording Rachel's name, title, and exact words. His composure was remarkable. Where most people would have exploded with righteous anger, he remained focused on gathering evidence. "Actually, I'm interested in executive-level positions. I have extensive experience in business development and strategic planning." His response was measured and professional, giving Rachel every opportunity to recognize her mistake and correct course. Instead, she doubled down on her prejudice. "Executive positions?" Rachel actually laughed, the sound sharp and cruel in the marble-lined lobby. "Sir, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but executive roles require extensive education, proven track records, and frankly, a certain level of presentation." The pause before presentation was loaded with meaning that everyone within earshot understood perfectly. That's when Chad Morrison, the branch director, made his entrance. Having heard the commotion from his corner office, he strutted over with the confidence of a man who believed his authority was absolute. Chad was everything wrong with corporate culture wrapped in an expensive suit, entitled arrogant, and completely convinced of his own superiority. At 45, he'd climbed the corporate ladder not through merit but through connections and an uncanny ability to tell people what they wanted to hear. "What's all this about?" Chad demanded, his voice carrying across the lobby like a challenge. When Rachel quickly explained the situation, Chad's reaction was even worse than what had come before. "Oh, this is rich," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Let me guess. Another diversity hire thinking he can just walk in and demand an executive position? That's not how the real world works, buddy." The microaggressions that followed were like watching a slow-motion disaster unfold. While Derrick waited patiently, other visitors were offered comfortable seating, coffee, and immediate attention. A young white woman who arrived after him was fast-tracked to an interview within minutes. The contrast was so stark that even other clients began to notice and exchange uncomfortable glances. Through it all, Derrick remained calm, his pen moving steadily across his notepad. Names, times, direct quotes, everything was being documented with the precision of a man who understood that justice requires evidence. What none of them realized was that their every word, their every dismissive gesture, was being recorded not just by Derrick's careful notes, but by the security cameras that he himself had ordered installed to ensure accountability throughout his company. The network of discrimination was now fully exposed, and the reckoning was about to begin. No one expected what happened next would transform a simple case of workplace discrimination into a viral moment that would reshape an entire corporate culture forever. The three employees who had systematically humiliated Derrick were about to cross a line that would make their actions impossible to ignore, while unknowingly providing him with the exact evidence he needed to expose the rot that had infected his own company. Chad Morrison's arrogance had reached a boiling point. After making his cruel comment about diversity hires, he began pacing in front of Derrick like a predator circling its prey. "You know what I think?" Chad said, his voice loud enough for the entire lobby to hear. "I think you're one of those people who thinks the world owes them something. Well, newsflash, this is a meritocracy. We don't hand out executive positions to make ourselves feel good about diversity quotas." The words hit the lobby like a thunderclap. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Employees froze at their desks. Even the security guard near the entrance turned to stare at the unfolding spectacle. But Derrick's response was not what anyone expected. Instead of defending himself or walking away in anger, he simply looked at his smartwatch and pressed a small button on the side. To everyone watching, it looked like he was checking the time. What they didn't know was that Derrick had just activated a recording function that would capture every word of what was about to unfold. "I understand your position," Derrick said calmly, his voice steady despite the mounting hostility. "But I'd like to understand your hiring process better. Are you saying that qualified candidates are judged solely on their appearance before you even review their credentials?" His question was logical and reasonable, which somehow made the responses even more damning. Rachel stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. "Sir, I don't appreciate your tone. You're questioning our professionalism when you're the one who walked in here without an appointment, without proper credentials, and frankly, without the basic understanding of how corporate environments work." Her words were like gasoline on a fire, each sentence more discriminatory than the last. That's when things escalated beyond anything even Derrick had anticipated. Chad pulled out his phone and began dialing security. "Yeah, we need someone in the main lobby. We have a situation with someone who's becoming disruptive and refusing to leave." The lie was so blatant, so obviously false to anyone who had witnessed the calm, respectful conversation, that several people in the lobby began exchanging shocked glances. But here's where the story takes an incredible turn. Among the witnesses was a young intern named Marcus Johnson, a 22-year-old recent graduate who had been working at Sterling and Associates for only 3 months. Marcus had been sitting in the lobby waiting for his mentor when the confrontation began, and what he was witnessing horrified him. As someone who had faced similar discrimination in his own job search, Marcus recognized exactly what was happening. More importantly, he decided to do something about it. Quietly, Marcus pulled out his smartphone and began recording the interaction. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of witnessing something he knew was historically significant. He had grown up hearing stories from his grandfather about the civil rights era, about moments when ordinary people had to choose between staying silent and standing up for what was right. This was his moment, and he wasn't going to let it pass by undocumented. The security guard who arrived was a middle-aged black man named Robert Williams, a veteran who had worked security for over 15 years. When he approached the group, Robert immediately sensed something was wrong. The supposed disruptive individual was standing calmly, notepad in hand, while the 3 employees were clearly agitated and hostile. Robert had seen real disruptions before: drunken clients, angry terminated employees, actual threats to safety. This wasn't any of those things. "What seems to be the problem here?" Robert asked, his voice professional but cautious. Chad immediately launched into a dramatic explanation about an aggressive individual who was refusing to leave and making threats. The description was so far from reality that Robert actually looked around to see if Chad was talking about someone else. Derrick looked directly at Robert and said quietly, "Officer, I've been nothing but respectful. I simply asked about job opportunities and have been told repeatedly that I don't belong here. I've made no threats, raised no voice, and have simply been documenting what I've experienced." His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the 3 employees who were practically vibrating with anger and frustration. Marcus continued recording, capturing not just the words but the body language, the facial expressions, the complete picture of systematic discrimination in action. Other employees had begun gathering at the edges of the lobby, some filming with their own phones, others whispering among themselves about what they were witnessing. The incident was no longer contained to a small group. It was becoming a public spectacle that would be impossible to cover up or deny. Robert found himself in an impossible position. His training told him to follow the direction of management, but his conscience told him that what he was witnessing was fundamentally wrong. The man they wanted removed had done nothing wrong, while the employees demanding his removal had just committed what was clearly a civil rights violation. The tension in the lobby was palpable. Multiple people were now recording. Security cameras captured every angle. And through it all, Derrick remained remarkably composed, his smartwatch continuing to document every second of what would become the most talked-about discrimination case in corporate history. The evidence was mounting, the witnesses were in place, and the moment of truth was approaching faster than anyone could have imagined. If this story is opening your eyes to the reality of workplace discrimination, please hit that like button to help us reach more people who need to hear this message. Share your own experiences in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your story could help someone else find the courage to speak up. And don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next will completely change how you think about justice, accountability, and the power of staying calm in the face of hatred. We're about to witness a revelation that will send shockwaves through everything these employees thought they knew about power and respect. Right at that moment, as security guard Robert Williams stood frozen between his duty and his conscience, Derrick made a decision that would change everything in ways no one could have imagined. The man who had endured 30 minutes of systematic humiliation, who had been called unqualified, unwelcome, and unworthy, was about to reveal a truth so shocking that it would send ripples through the entire corporate world. What happened next became the kind of moment that people talk about for years. The instant when power dynamics shift so dramatically that reality itself seems to bend. The lobby had grown eerily quiet. Marcus continued recording from his corner seat, his phone capturing every nuance of what was about to unfold. Other employees had gathered at the edges of the scene, some pretending to work while stealing glances at the confrontation. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and everyone seemed to sense that something monumental was about to happen. Derrick looked around at the faces surrounding him. Jennifer at the reception desk, her arms crossed defensively. Rachel, standing with her clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. Chad with his phone still in hand, ready to call additional security if needed, and Robert, the security guard whose conflicted expression revealed his internal struggle. These were people who worked for him, who drew paychecks that he personally approved, who benefited from the company culture he had spent 15 years building. And they had just shown him exactly how far his organization had strayed from its founding principles. "Before this goes any further," Derrick said, his voice carrying a new weight that made everyone unconsciously lean forward, "I think there's something you all need to know." He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and measured. The simple action caused Chad to tense up, as if expecting some kind of threat, but what Derrick pulled out was far more devastating than any weapon. It was a Sterling and Associates Executive ID badge, the kind that only senior leadership possessed. The badge gleamed under the lobby's crystal chandeliers as Derrick held it up for everyone to see. But more than that, he pulled out a second ID, his driver's license, and held them side by side. "My name is Derrick Anthony Lawson," he said, his voice now carrying the authority that had been hidden beneath his humble exterior. "I am the founder, chairman, and chief executive officer of Sterling and Associates Consulting. I personally started this company 15 years ago with a vision of creating a workplace where talent would be recognized regardless of background, race, or social status." The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute stillness that happens when reality shifts so dramatically that human brains need time to process what they're experiencing. Jennifer's mouth fell open, her defensive posture crumbling as the weight of her actions hit her like a physical blow. Rachel's clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering to the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo forever. Chad's face went through a remarkable transformation. From arrogant confidence to confusion to dawning horror as he realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. But Derrick wasn't finished. He had spent 30 minutes being systematically humiliated by his own employees, and now it was time for them to understand exactly what that meant. "So let me make sure I understand what just happened here," he continued, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of steel that made everyone in the lobby hold their breath. "I was told I don't belong in my own company. I was assumed to be looking for janitorial work because of the color of my skin. I was lectured about diversity hires and told I don't understand how corporate environments work. And then, when I remained respectful and professional throughout this entire ordeal, security was called to have me removed from the building that I own." The words hung in the air like an indictment, each sentence more damning than the last. Marcus, still recording from his corner, found himself fighting back tears as he witnessed what was essentially a real-time civil rights moment unfolding before his eyes. Other employees had begun gathering closer, drawn by the electric tension that seemed to pulse through the air. Robert, the security guard, was the first to find his voice. "Mr. Lawson," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so sorry. I had no idea. I knew something wasn't right about this whole situation." His words carried the weight of a man who had spent his career trying to do the right thing, only to find himself caught in someone else's web of discrimination. Jennifer tried to speak, her voice coming out as barely a whisper. "Mr. Lawson, I didn't know. I mean, how was I supposed to?" But her words trailed off because there was no explanation that could justify what had happened, no excuse that could make racial profiling acceptable, no corporate policy that endorsed the kind of systematic discrimination that had just been exposed. Chad, meanwhile, had gone completely pale. The man who had just lectured the CEO of his own company about diversity hires and meritocracy now looked like he was about to be sick. His phone, which he had used to call security on his own boss, trembled in his hand as the full implications of his actions began to sink in. Derrick looked around at each of them, his expression a mixture of disappointment and determination. "The question now," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just witnessed the complete failure of everything he had worked to build, "is what we're going to do about it. Because this isn't just about individual prejudice, this is about a culture that allowed this to happen, that enabled this kind of discrimination to flourish in a company that was supposed to stand for something better." The revelation was complete, but the reckoning was just beginning. In the space of 5 minutes, the entire power structure of the Sterling and Associates branch had been turned upside down, and everyone in that lobby knew that nothing would ever be the same again. What happened next would become legendary in corporate circles in a masterclass in how swift, decisive leadership can transform a moment of crisis into an opportunity for systemic change. The 3 employees who had spent the last 30 minutes systematically humiliating their own CEO were about to learn that actions have consequences, and that discrimination in any form would not be tolerated in the company Derrick had built from the ground up. Derrick pulled out his phone, not to call security like Chad had done, but to dial a number that would set into motion a chain of events that would reshape the entire branch. The number belonged to Sarah Chen, the Chief Human Resources Officer at Sterling and Associates headquarters, a woman who had worked alongside Derrick for over a decade and shared his unwavering commitment to equality and justice in the workplace. "Sarah, this is Derrick," he said, his voice carrying across the dead silent lobby. Every person within earshot strained to hear the conversation that would determine their fate. "I'm at the downtown branch, and we have a code red situation. I need you to connect me immediately to legal, corporate compliance, and the executive board. We have a discrimination incident that requires immediate intervention." The term code red wasn't corporate jargon. It was a specific protocol that Derrick had established years earlier for situations involving serious violations of company values. It meant that normal procedures were suspended, that immediate action was required, and that the full weight of corporate authority would be brought to bear on the situation. For the employees who had just revealed their true character, it was the sound of their careers crumbling in real time. Jennifer, still standing behind the reception desk, began to hyperventilate. The woman who had confidently told the CEO of her company that he didn't belong there was now gasping for air as the reality of her situation hit her like a tsunami. Rachel had sunk into one of the lobby chairs, her professional composure completely shattered as she stared at her hands and whispered, "Oh God, what have I done?" over and over again. But it was Chad's reaction that truly captured the magnitude of the moment. The man who had strutted around the lobby like he owned the place was now backing away from Derrick, as if proximity to the CEO might somehow make his situation worse. His face had gone from pale to green, and beads of sweat were forming on his forehead despite the perfectly climate-controlled environment. Within minutes, Derrick's phone was buzzing with return calls. The first came from Sarah Chen, whose voice could be heard clearly in the silent lobby. "Derrick, I've got legal on standby and I'm pulling the employment files for everyone involved. What's the situation?" Her efficiency was remarkable. This wasn't her first code red, and she knew exactly how to handle a crisis of this magnitude. "3 employees have engaged in systematic racial discrimination against me while I was conducting an undercover assessment of branch culture," Derrick explained, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I have documentation, witness testimony, and security footage of the entire incident. I need immediate suspension pending full investigation, and I want the branch's hiring practices audited going back 6 months." The words, "systematic racial discrimination," seemed to echo in the lobby like a death sentence. These weren't just workplace infractions or policy violations. These were potential civil rights violations that could result in federal investigations, lawsuits, and criminal charges. The 3 employees who had been so confident in their prejudices just minutes before were now facing the complete destruction of their professional lives. Marcus, still recording from his corner, found himself witnessing history in the making. This wasn't just about 3 employees being held accountable. This was about a CEO willing to expose the failures in his own organization, regardless of the cost to his company's reputation. The young intern had never seen leadership like this before, and he was capturing every second for posterity. The next call came from the company's legal department. "Mr. Lawson, we're prepared to implement immediate protective measures. Do you want the individuals involved escorted from the premises?" The question hung in the air like a sword, waiting to fall on the people who had thought they could discriminate with impunity. Derrick looked around at the 3 employees who had humiliated him, his expression unreadable. This was his moment of ultimate power, the chance to destroy the careers of people who had treated him with such contempt. But what he said next revealed the true character of a leader who had built a billion-dollar company on principles rather than revenge. "Yes, but I want this done professionally and with dignity," he said, his voice carrying across the lobby for everyone to hear. "These individuals have made serious errors in judgment, but they're still human beings. They'll be suspended immediately pending investigation, but they'll be treated with the respect that they failed to show others." The mercy in his words was stunning. Even after being systematically humiliated, even after watching his own employees reveal themselves to be everything he had worked against, Derrick was still choosing humanity over vengeance. It was a moment that revealed more about true leadership than any business school textbook could ever teach. But mercy didn't mean weakness, and accountability didn't stop with individual consequences. Derrick's next words would reshape the entire branch and send a message throughout the corporate world about what happens when discrimination is exposed at the highest levels. "I'm also implementing immediate emergency protocols," he continued, his voice now carrying the full authority of his position. "This branch is closed to new business effective immediately. All hiring processes are suspended pending a complete audit, Every employee will undergo mandatory bias training, and we're implementing a new oversight system to ensure this never happens again. The gasps that rippled through the lobby were audible. Closing a branch wasn't just about accountability, it was about sending a message that discrimination would not be tolerated at any level, regardless of the financial cost. The downtown branch of Sterling and Associates generated millions in revenue annually, but Derrick was willing to sacrifice profit for principle. Security personnel from headquarters began arriving within the hour, not to remove a troublemaker as Chad had requested, but to escort the 3 discriminatory employees from the building they had tried to bar their own CEO from entering. The irony was poetic, but the justice was real. As Jennifer, Rachel, and Chad gathered their personal belongings under security escort, the lobby remained silent except for the sound of their footsteps on the marble floor. Other employees watched in stunned silence as 3 careers ended in real time. Victims not of corporate politics or economic downturns, but of their own prejudice and hatred. The reckoning was swift, decisive, and complete. But this was only the beginning of a transformation that would extend far beyond 3 terminated employees. But what came next proved that true leadership isn't just about delivering justice, it's about transforming tragedy into triumph, turning moments of darkness into opportunities for lasting light. As the 3 terminated employees disappeared through the revolving doors of Sterling and Associates for the final time, Derrick began implementing changes that would not only heal the wounds they had inflicted, but create a legacy of equality that would inspire corporate America for generations to come. The lobby, still buzzing with the energy of what had just transpired, became quiet as Derrick turned his attention to the young man who had been sitting in the corner throughout the entire ordeal. Marcus Johnson, the intern who had risked his own position to document the discrimination, found himself face to face with the CEO whose courage he had just witnessed firsthand. What happened next would change the trajectory of his entire life. "Marcus," Derrick said, walking over to where the young man sat with his phone still in hand, "I need to thank you for what you did today." Recording that incident took real courage, especially for someone just starting their career. His words carried genuine warmth and gratitude, but Marcus could sense there was more coming. Marcus stood up, his voice slightly shaky with emotion. "Mr. Lawson, what I witnessed today was wrong on every level. I couldn't just sit there and let it happen without documentation. My grandfather used to tell me stories about the civil rights era, about moments when people had to choose between staying silent and doing what's right. Today felt like one of those moments." The wisdom in those words, coming from someone barely out of college, struck Derrick profoundly. Here was a young man who understood that real change requires individual courage, that progress happens when people decide to act rather than simply observe. It was exactly the kind of thinking that Derrick wanted to cultivate throughout his organization. "Marcus, I want to offer you something," Derrick said, his voice carrying the weight of opportunity. "I'm creating a new position, Director of Diversity and Inclusion Innovation. It's not just a title or a token role. I want you to work directly with me to completely reimagine how we build inclusive culture throughout Sterling and Associates. You'll have resources, authority, and direct access to implement real change." The offer was stunning in its scope and significance. Marcus had walked into the office that morning as a low-level intern hoping to learn something about corporate culture. He was leaving as a director-level executive with the mandate to transform one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the country. The transformation was so dramatic it was almost difficult to process. But Derrick's vision for reform extended far beyond individual promotions. Over the next hour, as employees throughout the building began to understand what had happened, he outlined a comprehensive transformation plan that would address not just the symptoms of discrimination but its root causes. The changes he announced would become a model for corporate America. Effective immediately, Derrick announced to the assembled staff, "We're launching the Sterling Equity Initiative. This isn't just about preventing future incidents. It's about actively creating opportunities for people who have been historically excluded from spaces like this. His words carried the passion of someone who had just witnessed firsthand how his life's work had been corrupted by prejudice. The first component of the initiative was revolutionary in its scope. Sterling and Associates would establish a scholarship fund, seeded with $2 million from the company's executive compensation pool, specifically designed to provide educational opportunities for underrepresented students pursuing careers in business consulting. But this wasn't just about money. It was about creating a pipeline of diverse talent that would fundamentally change the industry. The second component addressed the immediate culture problem. Every employee would undergo comprehensive bias training, but not the typical corporate workshop that everyone forgets within a week. Derrick was partnering with leading universities and civil rights organizations to create an immersive educational program that would help employees understand not just what discrimination looks like, but why it happens and how to prevent it. Perhaps most importantly, Derrick announced the creation of the Community Impact Fund, a program that would direct a percentage of every project's profits toward organizations working to address systemic inequality in the communities where Sterling and Associates operated. This wasn't charity, it was accountability, a recognition that successful businesses have a responsibility to address the social problems that their success often perpetuates. Robert Williams, the security guard who had found himself caught between duty and conscience, was also part of Derrick's redemptive vision. "Robert," Derrick said, approaching the man who had handled an impossible situation with such grace, "I want you to head up our new community relations department. Your job will be to ensure that what happened today never happens again, not just here but in any Sterling and Associates location." The promotion was more than just recognition. It was a statement that character matters more than credentials. That the person who had shown moral courage in a moment of crisis was exactly the kind of leader the company needed going forward. Robert's eyes filled with tears as he accepted the position, knowing that his entire career had led to this moment of opportunity. As the day wore on, word of what had happened at Sterling and Associates began spreading throughout the business community. Social media exploded with Marcus's video, which had captured not just the discrimination but Derrick's measured response and the swift justice that followed. The hashtag #RealAccountability began trending as people shared their own stories of workplace discrimination and called for other leaders to follow Derrick's example. The transformation was complete, but it was also just beginning. What had started as a routine visit to check on company culture had become a watershed moment that would influence corporate policies nationwide. Derrick had taken a moment of personal humiliation and transformed it into a catalyst for systemic change that would benefit countless people for years to come. The lobby that had witnessed such cruelty just hours before was now filled with hope, possibility, and the kind of energy that comes from knowing you're part of something truly transformative. What emerged from this extraordinary day would become more than just a corporate success story. It became a blueprint for how moral courage and strategic leadership can transform an entire industry and inspire a generation to demand better from the institutions that shape our society. The ripple effects of Derrick's actions that day would extend far beyond the marble walls of Sterling and Associates, creating waves of change that continue to influence how businesses approach equality, accountability, and human dignity in the workplace. 6 months after that transformative day, the results of Derrick's bold leadership were undeniable and inspiring. The Sterling Equity Initiative had not only met its goals but exceeded them in ways that surprised even Derrick himself. The scholarship program had already provided full educational funding to 47 students from underrepresented communities, many of whom were now interning at Sterling and Associates and bringing fresh perspectives that were revolutionizing how the company approached client solutions. Marcus Johnson, now thriving in his role as Director of Diversity and Inclusion Innovation, had implemented programs that were being studied and replicated by Fortune 500 companies across the nation. His approach combined data-driven analysis with grassroots community engagement, creating sustainable change that went beyond surface-level diversity metrics to address the deeper cultural issues that enable discrimination to flourish. The Community Impact Fund had directed over $5 million toward organizations working on systemic inequality, but more importantly, it had created partnerships that were helping Sterling and Associates understand and serve communities that had previously been excluded from high-level business consulting. The company's client base had diversified dramatically, and their innovative approaches to inclusive business development were generating record profits while creating positive social impact. Robert Williams had transformed the Community Relations Department into a model that other security and facilities management companies were eager to emulate. His background as a security professional, combined with his natural understanding of human dignity and respect, had created protocols that ensured every person entering a Sterling and Associates facility would be treated with the courtesy and professionalism that should be standard in any business environment. But perhaps the most powerful outcome was the cultural transformation that had occurred throughout the organization. The comprehensive bias training program had evolved into an ongoing education initiative that helped employees understand not just what discrimination looks like, but how unconscious biases shape decision-making in subtle but significant ways. Employee satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in workplace culture, and the company was now regularly featured in lists of the best places to work for people of all backgrounds. The 3 employees who had been terminated that day had also become part of the story's lasting impact, though in ways they never could have anticipated. Jennifer Mills had undergone a profound personal transformation, enrolling in diversity and inclusion certification programs, and eventually becoming an advocate for workplace equality. She had reached out to Derrick personally to apologize and to share how the experience had opened her eyes to biases she never realized she held. Rachel Matthews had taken a different path, using her experience as a cautionary tale in corporate training seminars about the real-world consequences of workplace discrimination. Her willingness to speak openly about her mistakes had helped countless other HR professionals recognize and address similar issues in their own organizations before they could cause harm. Even Chad Morrison, whose arrogance had made him the most visible antagonist in the story, had eventually found a form of redemption. After months of unemployment and deep personal reflection, he had dedicated himself to understanding the roots of his prejudice and was now working for a non-profit organization focused on addressing systemic racism in corporate hiring practices. His insider knowledge of how discrimination operates in professional environments had made him an unexpectedly effective advocate for change. The security footage and Marcus's recording of that day had become powerful educational tools used in business schools and corporate training programs as an example of how discrimination manifests in seemingly professional environments and how leadership can respond decisively to create positive change. The video had been viewed millions of times, inspiring countless other CEOs and business leaders to examine their own organizations more critically and to implement proactive measures to prevent similar incidents. Most importantly, the story had sparked a nationwide conversation about the responsibility of business leaders to create truly inclusive environments. Derrick's example had shown that accountability doesn't just mean firing people who discriminate, it means building systems that prevent discrimination from taking root in the first place and creating opportunities for historically excluded communities to thrive. The lesson that resonated most powerfully was beautifully simple, yet profoundly challenging. Never judge someone by the way they walk in, because you never know who they truly are until they show you. But more than that, it demonstrated that how we treat people says far more about our character than it does about theirs. The employees who discriminated against Derrick that day thought they were proving their superiority, but instead they revealed the poverty of their values and the limitations of their vision. Derrick's story became a testament to the transformative power of integrity under pressure. When faced with hatred and discrimination, he chose documentation over retaliation, strategic action over emotional reaction, and systemic reform over personal revenge. His response proved that true leadership isn't about wielding power to punish enemies. It's about using authority to create opportunities for everyone to succeed. The final message that echoed through corporate America was clear and unwavering. In a world where discrimination still exists, where prejudice still shapes opportunities, and where inequality still limits human potential, each of us has a choice. We can be part of the problem or part of the solution. We can perpetuate systems that exclude and diminish, or we can build institutions that welcome and elevate. The choice, as Derrick proved that transformative day, is always ours to make. Here's the truth that most people don't want to admit. Discrimination isn't always about hatred. It's often about assumptions we don't even realize we're making. I've spent 15 years in corporate environments, and I can tell you that what happened to Derrick happens every single day in offices across America, just without the cameras rolling. The difference is that most victims don't have the power to fight back, and most witnesses don't have the courage to speak up. But Derrick's story teaches us something profound about the power of composure under pressure. He could have exploded with anger, walked away in frustration, or played the victim card. Instead, he chose the path of strategic documentation and transformative leadership. That's the difference between revenge and justice, between destroying individuals and rebuilding systems. Real change doesn't come from tearing people down. It comes from lifting everyone up while holding people accountable for their actions. The most powerful lesson here isn't about karma or comeuppance. It's about the choice we all face when confronted with injustice. We can be bystanders who enable discrimination through our silence, or we can be allies who document truth and demand better. Marcus Johnson proved that you don't need to be the CEO to make a difference. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one with the courage to press record. If this story opened your eyes to the reality of workplace bias, if it reminded you that change is possible when people choose courage over comfort, then this channel is exactly where you need to be. Hit that like button to help us reach more people who need to hear these stories of accountability and transformation. Drop a comment sharing your own experiences with workplace discrimination. Your voice matters and could inspire someone else to speak up. And subscribe right now because we're just getting started with stories that prove justice isn't just a dream. It's a choice we can all make, one courageous moment at a time.